Thank you. I'm grateful to be here to talk about gardening. I'm not an expert, but I'm learning every year, and I look at the age level here, and a lot of you are veteran gardeners, and I'm sure I can learn a lot from you, more than probably you can learn from me. But if I can today, for the next hour, just share a few little gardening tips that kind of help me succeed, some of the mistakes I've made. Hopefully we can all learn together, and then at the end, if you have to ask any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer those for you. I've been an active gardener ever since I was a little guy. I used to garden with my dad and my grandpa. And back then we had huge gardens, and I don't know how we did it, but I guess Dad needed one of those to support me and my two older brothers. But it was a great opportunity for me to learn about plants and to play in the dirt. And when I graduated from high school, looking to study in college, my interest was plants, so I went into nursery landscape management, got a degree at BYU, Idaho, and after that I became employed with Moana Nursery, and I've been here for 31 years. I tell people I'll never retire, I'll just keep working here until I get planted myself. So that's probably what's going to happen. And it's interesting, in this field there is so much to learn. It'll take several lifetimes to learn everything there possibly is about plants, about vegetables. Every day I work here, I learn something new about vegetables, flowers, insects, and so it's an exciting field to be in. If any of you are thinking of starting a second career, get into gardening, you know. But I have this little comic right here. This was back in 2009 when it just seemed like it just kept on snowing and snowing and snowing, and I thought that was appropriate for our Reno weather because you never know when it's time to get gardening here. And gardening has kind of advanced from just regular gardening to organic gardening. When I first started here decades ago, all we had for organic fertilizer was steer manure and chicken manure, and that was it. Everything else was, you know, kill the environment chemicals and all that. But I've seen a gradual movement. Now I'd say over 50% of all the chemicals we sell and amendments are organic, and that's because a lot of people are wanting to use them. And so organic gardening, as you can see right here, it's just using animal, vegetative, mineral fertilizers instead of the synthetic ones that are made, and using natural pest controls that take care of insects. And I have right here, you're probably looking and wondering what this is. We've been selling a lot of these. These are ladybugs. In fact, there's about 100, there's 1,500 in here. I know that because when we first started selling ladybugs, people would look at this and go, oh, there's not that many in there. You guys are just false advertising. So I took one of these and I went back in the florist cooler and I emptied them out on the florist floor where it's nice and cold. It slows them down. And I took a little knife and I counted them. And yes, there is 1,500 in here. It took me a while. So that's the truth. But there's a lot of different ways of controlling insects naturally. I mean, sometimes they aren't as effective, but it's better for the environment. The thing I like about spring is that we get an extra hour of time to garden, daylight savings time. So that's exciting too, you know. Benefits of organic gardening, and there's just a lot of them, but it just seems like whenever you garden and go organically there, your plants seem to be higher in essential nutrients and vitamins that your body uses to fight off cancer and everything. The big plus is if you do your own gardening and you use natural controls, then you aren't intaking chemicals of any sort. And I was reading a couple years ago where they did a survey. I can't remember which university it was, and don't quote me on it because I can't remember, but it was interesting. They did a survey where they had children that were eating vegetables from their home garden, which was organically based, and they also had children that were eating vegetables that were bought from the store. And then after they did that, they went ahead and tested the children, and they found out that the children that ate vegetables from store-bought had more chemical residue in them than those who ate organically grown veggies. And that's kind of scary to me as a parent because, you know, a grandparent, you're always concerned about your kids and their health and everything. So that's just another plus of if you do your own gardening and you kind of use natural controls, it's healthier for the family. And I must say that, you know, gardening, and whenever you taste your own produce, it just tastes a lot better, whether you eat it on the table or you do what I do. I graze in my garden. I just go out in the morning and I pick a tomato, I eat it, grab some spinach leaves and some chives, and I'm just munching in the yard, and that's my breakfast sometimes. So that's kind of exciting to do that. Plus, it's just a good stress reliever. We all know that, working in the yard, you got the sunshine, the smell of the earth, you get exercise. As long as you take a couple ibuprofen, you're okay. That's what I do. Because it's work. When you get to be my age, you know, you do everything you can. And the other thing I like about it is it strengthens families. I remember gardening with my family. What a great memory that is, because we're all together, working together, growing things. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that just kind of bonded us together. So whenever you have a chance to garden, involve the grandkids, your kids, get everyone involved. It's just a great event where you're growing things and feeling good about the whole experience. There's a lot of different garden layouts. This is how they do it in France. You know, I just looked at that and it just reminds me of the French gardens that they have and everything else. But you can be really extravagant like this. You know, these are just all the walkways, and then you do gardening here if you have the time. If you don't have a lot of space, you can see this lady right here is just making use of that small little spot right there. And it's amazing how much you can grow in just a small little location. This is a picture of one of our employees here. Her name is Sally. She works in our design department. This is her backyard. And she's kind of laid her garden out in little rows, the old-fashioned style. And she's quite the gardener. You'll see here that, you know, she's got her tomato plants right there with drip irrigation, then rows of other crops. And of course, by the end of the season, you get a bountiful harvest. And that's what it's all about, you know. It seems like I'm always growing too much because around September or whatever, my tomatoes are still producing, and I'm asking my neighbors to come over and everything, and it's just, it's great to have that extra produce, and whatever I have left over, I just freeze and throw in the freezer and use for soups and other meals, which is great. Just a few little pointers here. Depending on how much room you have, you always want to kind of start small. I remember the first garden I did as a young father, I had high hopes, and it was only 100 square feet, 10 by 10, but my kids were really little, and they didn't really help out much, and it just became too much for me. You know, the weeding and spraying for bugs and making sure everything was watered. So if you can kind of start small and get used to growing things, after that you can kind of expand your garden space. Always keep in mind that when you're gardening, you want to have at least 6 to 8 hours of sun every day. In my yard, I live in a very mature neighborhood, so I have massive shade trees. And so I don't have one specific plot. What I do is I have big containers, and I just go ahead and plant my vegetables in those containers, and I move them where the sun is. So there may be a couple tomato plants over here on my porch. There may be some in the back corner where it gets sun. So that way they're getting as much sun as possible. And believe me, you know, I have like a big 15-gallon container that I plant tomatoes in. I get plenty of produce just out of that one pot, and it's easy to kind of move around. So it is possible to take advantage of the sun you have, even if you have trees. Always try not to set up your garden underneath trees because of the roots and the shade. And a lot of times people don't think about that. They start getting their garden ready in the winter time when the trees are dormant. And then they start planting, and then the trees start developing their leaves, and they realize that, you know, in the afternoon their garden's shaded by the tree. So be careful where you set up your garden. Make sure it has plenty of sun. Keep it level and close to a water source. If you have your garden out in the back 40 and it's hard to drag your hose out there, I can almost promise you're going to be a little bit negligent in watering because it's extra work to unravel the hose and drag it across the yard. So try to keep it in an area where it's easy to water. It just makes it easier for everyone involved. We'll be talking about the soil and everything else, in taking care of the soil, average frost dates. I'll be talking about that here. Does anyone know our average frost date in May, in the spring? The last day it usually freezes? About the 15th, yeah, but it can go beyond that too. That's why they call it an average, but it's good to know those dates when you're timing your planting. And there's different types of ways of irrigating your garden. And you can use drip irrigation, that's what I use, or you can just hand water if you like to be out in your yard every day. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Soil is probably the most important thing that we need to be worried about. Our soils in Nevada are just not the best. I think we have less than 5% organic matter. And a lot of soils have a lot of high clay content, and just isn't really good. If you're in a new home or whatever, it seems like the base and the backfill they bring in for the foundation, they don't haul it away. They just kind of put it in your flower beds, and then you start digging and you hit rock and base and all this bad soil, and then you go, great, now what do I do? Rather than removing all that dirt, we tell people to condition it with compost, organic matter. Like there's different products here. This is a bag of Dr. Earth organic mix here. It's got you know, a lot of compost in there, plus it has mycorrhizae and microbes and bone meal, chicken meal, and things like that that are just good natural products to put in the soil. That compost that's in there, it kind of helps retain the nutrients when you fertilize and just keeps it there for the plant to use. Compost also helps with drainage and soil structure. And your soil needs to be such that there's little air pockets in there for the water to get in and for oxygen. If your soil is just really compact and hard pan or whatever else, the soil and the oxygen can't get in there, the roots won't thrive, and then you just have stunted growth. So I always tell people when you're gardening, the first and most important thing you need to do is just get your soil ready. And if you can prepare your soil and add lots of organic matter and get it in the right spot, you're going to have success. But if you rush into it and just kind of dig and plant without any thought of feeding your soil, then your garden won't be as successful. Now, maybe some people don't want to do that because they don't have to worry about harvesting so much, but you know, you want to get the biggest bang out of your buck there. And this kind of is a little chart that kind of shows how the minerals that we have in the soil. This is coarse sand. You'll see clay. You'll see how small it is right there. It's just very tiny. You get a bunch of those together, they just compact, and it doesn't let anything go through. So that's just a little thing. The other thing that you guys all need to know, and you probably know already, is that our soil is like a living ecosystem. Not only are there minerals in there and organic matter, but there are little microbes, and they're the ones that kind of help break down different types of fertilizer and make it available to the plant. There's fungi, and they kind of help with the water absorption of the roots. There's worms, and the worms go through and they just process that soil, and they help with the soil structure. We want to take care of the soil. And whenever you're gardening, you know, you don't want to garden in an area where you've been parking your RV for 20 years and it's all compacted. Or you don't want to use an area where you put down some kind of chemical to keep the weeds from growing for the last 10 years. You want to kind of pick an area that's just nice and fresh, that doesn't have any residual chemicals or any compaction problems. And that's another reason why we kind of shy away from using synthetic chemicals or pesticides, because they can actually kill the microbes in the soil and ruin the soil environment. So whenever you can use organic controls, maybe do a little bit more hand pulling or picking the bugs off the leaves. I know that's kind of hard to do. It's better for the soil. When it comes to the soil, I think I talked to you about good drainage, the pH. That's really important. pH has to do with the ratio of hydrogen and oxygen in the soil. And the ideal range is around 6 to 6.5. Our soils in Reno are typically high pH, but whenever you add compost or anything like that, that lowers the pH down to where it should be. So a lot of times people say, I want to go ahead and do a soil test to make sure my soil is okay. Yes, you can do that, but if you don't have time to do it, if you can just add organic matter, That's going to make a big difference for your soil. And we talked about soil biology and how all the organisms are in there. You want to encourage them to stay in there and keep growing. And we have two types of plants or groups of plants that we put in the spring. We have the cool season crops, which you can see right here, the peas, lettuce, cabbage, and so forth. These are crops that do best in cool soil. And they typically will mature and finish developing their finished product by around June or sometime. If you plant these midsummer, they'll just go to seed and they won't function well at all. So with cool season crops, you can plant them in the spring, usually starting around February. You can also do a third planting in the fall, which a lot of people don't do, but these cool season plants here, you can go ahead and plant in like August, September and get another crop, because by then the weather's cooling off, so you can kind of increase your vegetable production by doing that. One time I planted spinach in September, and I was able to harvest a lot of spinach, and then during the winter my leaves from my trees kind of was a mulch over them and just kind of saved them through the winter. And then in the spring, my spinach plant came back twice as big and kept on producing. It was just amazing. So with these cool season crops, with your, especially with your spinach, and even cauliflower and broccoli, the same thing happened. It overwintered and came back in the spring, and I had twice as much. So those cold season crops are really good. The warm season ones are the ones that everyone tries to plant too early, and that's like your tomatoes and your peppers and everything else. Yes, we do have peppers in the nursery because people want to plant them. And you can do that as long as you watch the weather. And if it's going to freeze, you got to bring them in or cover them. And one thing that a lot of people do is they will use these season extenders, like this guy right here. I don't know if you can see or not. It used to be called Wall of Waters years ago. And it's a little teepee here that you just kind of fill with water, and you just kind of put it around your tomato plant or your pepper plant, and it kind of keeps it from freezing at night. It also takes in the heat during the day and radiates into the plant during the evening hours. And so by using this, you can kind of get an extra start on your tomatoes and peppers. Be careful though, because it is filled with water, and your tomato plant's in the middle. If we get a high wind or it shifts, it'll just fall over, and your tomato plant will be a ground cover. And so you got to be careful with that. Some people, when they set this up, they'll kind of put some stakes in there just to give it extra support so it doesn't fall over on your plant. We also have what is called a harvest guard. What it is, it's just a real fine spun fabric. And you can kind of put this over your crops and everything when there's a heavy frost, and it can kind of help alleviate the damage of frost. It can also be used to put over your plants to kind of keep certain bugs out. I'll be talking about that in a minute. But if you kind of cover them with this, and it kind of keeps out certain bugs and reduces your insect problem. But those are things that you can use to kind of keep your vegetables and everything from getting nipped by the frost to a certain point. I also have over here, and this is kind of new, I don't want to forget, with technology, there's a chemical that you can spray on your plants. It's called freeze-proof. It's a type of a polymer that you just spray on your plants, and it helps it reduce, helps it become more resistant to the frost. So, if it gets down to, most plants will freeze at 32 degrees, but if you spray this on them hours before the anticipated frost, they'll be able to withstand a frost down 9 degrees below 32. So that's pretty good, but it's expensive, and you just want to use it on certain plants. If you try to use this on all your vegetables, you may be spending more money on this than you would buying a bushel or two at the local grocery store. So it's just something out there that you can utilize if you've never tried it before. I haven't done any experiments on it, but if we get another frost here in the next week or two, and yes, we probably will, maybe several, I'm just going to go ahead and take 2 tomato plants. I'll spray one with this, and I'll leave one out there as a sacrifice, and then see what happens, I hope my boss approves. If not, well, That'll be an extra $5 out of my pocket. Okay, the warm season plants like tomatoes, peppers, and corn, they like the warm soil. And if a lot of times if you plant these prematurely, they'll just sit in the soil. So, case in point, I have a neighbor that was just a half a block away from me. His name is George. I talked to him, and he had a little small plot of ground. And I would always plant my tomatoes, you know, as early as I could, like maybe May 1st, which is still kind of early, and the soil's still kind of cold, and thinking I would get a head start. So they would just be sitting in the ground because the soil is just still cool, and they don't grow that well. And I would always drive by his house, and I'm going, man, George, he hasn't planted his tomatoes yet. And he would always plant his tomatoes the 1st of June. And I thought that was way too late. I said, oh, you know, I got him beat. But you know, after 2 weeks, his tomato plants were taller than mine, and I had planted mine a month earlier because he was smart. He goes, well, you know, I'll be patient. I'll plant them when the soil's warmer. And so just keep that in mind with a lot of your warm season crops, especially corn. If you plant corn too early and the soil stays cool, they'll just sit there and they'll rot, especially if you get a lot of late spring rains. So you want to get these things in when it's kind of warm. And if you can use the season extenders, that's good too. So keep that in mind. We got plenty of growing time, and if you can plant your veggies at the right time, you'll have success. Common insect pests are aphids. I don't know if any of you have aphids on any of your plants, but I sure do. And if you want, you know, if you want to go the organic way, you can use our ladybugs. They can eat about 50 aphids a day, and then when they're all through eating, they fly back to Moana Nursery. We repackage them and sell them to somebody else. So they're great bugs. We also have praying mantis eggs right here. These are little egg sacs like that, and you just take a little thread and you thread it through the twig there and just hang it from a bush, and then after a few weeks, you know, several hundred of these little baby guys will come out, and they'll probably eat half of each other before they get moving. But if you can get a few praying mantis in your yard, they eat quite a few insects. In fact, I had one as a pet one time when my kids were small, and we would feed it caterpillars and ants, and it's just really gross, but the kids loved it. So that's something to get your kids involved with gardening there. Have any of you seen this, tomato hornworm? Those guys are voracious eaters. And I've seen them eat leaves, like, you know, 7 or 8 leaves a day, and then they'll go up to your fruit and they'll just kind of munch on your tomatoes. There is a product, and I forgot to bring it. It's called BT. It's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a biological control. It's a spore that you just spray on your plants, and when they eat the leaf that has the spore, after about 24 hours, they stop eating, and then they die. So it's a good product. So you can either use that, or if you have strong nerves, you can pick them off by hand. But I'll tell you, when you grab them, they kind of squirm like this, back and forth, and it feels like they're biting you and everything. But so either way, I imagine they'd make good bait for fishing or whatever, catch a big bass or something, but I've never tried that. Cabbage worm, if you see any of these little butterflies, the white with the little black dots flying around your cabbage or your broccoli or things like that, they're laying eggs, and the eggs will hatch into a little worm that will eat little holes in your cabbage and your broccoli and everything else. So yeah, again, if you do use that, you can use the BT that I was telling you about. That's just a good spray that'll take care of those caterpillars when they start feeding. This is probably the one that most people hate the most. If you grow pumpkins or squash and zucchini, these guys always surface, and it's called a squash bug. And you don't really see them until they're in big numbers, but they have little sucking mouth parts, and they'll actually feed on the stem and cause the leaf to droop. They'll even feed on the fruit and cause the zucchini or pumpkins to be disformed and everything else. So they're a tough insect to get rid of. They're hard to kill because they're always moving. They're on the underside of the plant. They're down in the middle there. So a lot of times people will, if you know you had that problem last year, you'll most likely have the problem again this year. So when your zucchini and your pumpkins are growing, if you can take a little extra time each day and just look on the underside of the leaves, if you see any little egg masses, just squish them. And that'll reduce your problem considerably. If you don't, and you find out you got a bunch of these bugs here, you can spray with a lot of different insecticides. Some that we have are called pyrethrins, which is an organic control. It's derived from a chrysanthemum. It's quite effective, but you got to get it on the insect. Or you can just kind of hand pick them. And that's fun too. You just kind of grab them, then you throw them in a little bucket of soapy water and they drown. So those are different things you can do to take care of those guys. If you grow spinach, which I did, I had trouble with leaf miners, and it's just a real tiny insect that kind of feeds in between the leaf, and it kind of creates these little zigzags in your foliage. You really can't use any kind of insecticide on that because it's inside, so the best control is just to pick off the leaves that have it and just make sure you throw those away, but don't leave them in your garden or your compost pile, because the larvae that actually come out of there will drop to the ground, and then it'll hatch into a little fly, and the fly will lay eggs on more spinach or lettuce, and then you've got the same problem. So just remove the actual leaf and throw it away, and the problem is solved. Or if you're looking for an additional protein supplement, just eat the leaf the way it is. I did that once by accident, and it didn't kill me. So we have a lot of natural pest controls. Biological, I told you about, beneficial insects like the ladybugs and the praying mantis. Mechanical control is just like hand removal or putting barriers around your plants to keep insects from laying eggs in the leaves. There are a lot of different soaps, oils, and abrasives. This is called diatomaceous earth. It's like a little powder, a talcum powder. But if you take a look at this on a microscope, it's just they're little diatoms, I think it's they get it from the sea or whatever, just small, the skeleton of the little guys that float around, and they're really sharp and they cut. And so what happens when the insect walks across this powder, they get cut and they get dehydrated. So you can just kind of sprinkle this around, and it kills those creepy crawly insects, and they aren't happy when they get all cut up. We have this right here is a vegetable insect killer, and it's a mixture of different soaps, and a soap will actually kind of dry up the insect too and kill it or burn it. They also have repellents in there like rosemary and garlic and scented things that kind of repel the insect away from the plant. And so these are just natural ways of controlling your insects that you may have in your yard or in your garden. And you know, this chemical's been around for a long time. It's called F.A.M.E. And a lot of times if your insect population gets to be to the point where your organics just really can't get it under control, sometimes you may have to use this for effective control temporarily, because I call this chemical the damn the environment, I don't care, I want to kill the bugs. But it works. But again, it's something that kind of resides in the soil for a few weeks, and it can do some damage to other beneficial insects. So this is just something to use as a last resort. You know, if the botanicals can't keep it under control, then use a little bit of this, and you're set. When it comes to weeds, I don't know, I never have any trouble with weeds in my garden. Do any of you? I tell you, it's almost impossible. You know, they start really small and you don't see them, and it just seems like 2 weeks later they're 3 feet tall and they're blocking the sun and everything. But a lot of times people will use different things to keep their weeds down. They'll use mulches, which, you know, they can take some just compost and just kind of cover the area, and that keeps the weeds to a minimum. Hand pulling or hoeing is effective, but it takes a lot of labor and a lot of back strength and everything, and I try not to do as much of that as possible. But sometimes if you can keep up on it, you know, every day, but sometimes you can't visit your garden every day. There are other products like corn gluten. And I have that on the other table there, but it's just a natural product that you just kind of sprinkle it around and water it in, and it forms a little barrier, kind of like a sheet of plastic, and the weeds can't go through that. And that's a safe mulch to use. Sometimes people will take a piece of black plastic and they'll just cover the whole garden with it, and then they'll cut little holes, and then they'll do their plantings in those specific holes, and that way none of the other weeds can grow up through the plastic except where that hole is, and that minimizes it quite a bit. So, and then there are home remedies, and I'm not going to go over those because you get on the internet and type in home remedies for weeds. There's all kinds of them. Some people recommend vinegar or, you know, shaving cream. I don't know. They're out there, but you can experiment and find out on your own. A lot of times when you're planting your garden, you don't realize it, but the quail are watching you, the rabbits, and everything else, and they can be just as much of a problem. I mean, it's tough enough growing vegetables in Reno when you got to deal with the late frosts and our poor soil and everything else. But once you get that all taken care of, then you got to worry about the insects and the birds and everything else. And so probably the biggest problem we have is just birds, especially quail. I always tell people when they're planting their lettuce seeds, I go, do you have any quail in your backyard? And they go, yes, I do. Okay, well, before you when you plant your lettuce seeds, make sure you cover your rows with chicken wire. Because as soon as those seeds germinate, they'll see those little tiny leaves, and they'll be all wiped out in one night. So make sure that you do that until they get a little bit taller, and then the quail don't seem to bother them. Rabbits are a real problem. If you live out South Reno or out in the foothills and everything else, rabbits just love nice fresh greens. And you really can't shoot them. Believe it or not, they're a protected animal. And but you can use physical barriers, you know, like fencing or whatever. And or you can use what's out there. These are called different types of repellents. Like this guy right here is called plant skid, and it's actually dried blood in granules. And the smell of blood is kind of supposedly is repulsive to rabbits, so you just sprinkle that around your garden, and that'll keep them away. But you need to reapply. It's like a regular maintenance thing. You apply it once really heavy to kind of make a statement like stay out, and then, you know, every week or two you apply a little bit more just to kind of maintain it. And so it works. I like this product because it's got a guarantee. If it doesn't work, you bring it in. And no, we won't give you new vegetables or anything, but we'll get you a new bag or your money back. So there are also repellents like this, and these are a concoction of a stinky, smelly stuff. Yeah, I read the label here. It says whole egg solids, which is just rotten eggs. White pepper, cloves, garlic, oil. So, you know, the animals, they smell that, or it gets in their nasal passage, they aren't really happy, so they tend to stay away. I tell people that whenever you use repellents, it's not 100% effective. I mean, they're bound to get through, and they may hold their nose and go across the barrier or do something, but, you know, you always want to kind of use a combination, you know, maybe use a little bit of this and maybe a physical barrier, kind of do a little three-pronged approach to control those little rodents that may be in your visiting your garden at night when you're sleeping, thinking that everything is growing well. Last year we had a real problem with snakes. They really don't eat anything, but when you're working in your garden and you see a little, what is it, a gopher snake, I think, or a king snake, they can really scare you. So we even have a snake repellent, and supposedly it works, but we sold a lot of this last year. In previous years we haven't, but last year, for whatever reason, the snakes were out in big numbers, just slithering away. And I also have on here decoys, which would be, we have inflatable snakes that you can kind of put in your yard that kind of scares away rabbits and everything. One time we had the inflatable snakes at the nursery, and they're very lifelike, so I inflated it just to put it out there for people to see it. But more times than not, when people saw it, they jumped and said, oh my, a snake. So I had to deflate it and just put it back on the shelf because it caused too many problems there. We also have, and people will use like owls with a rotating head. And owls supposedly are predators for birds and everything else. And so you can kind of put that in your garden area, and that tends to help too quite a bit. So we talked a little bit about season extenders. You'll see this one picture right over here. That's the inside of a, looks like an eggplant or something, surrounded by a wall of water. And then you got, you know, cold frames. And this is that little fabric I was telling you about that's used to kind of cover for light frost. If you get a real heavy frost, it won't work. Or you can just have a little greenhouse on the side of your house, and that'll protect from frost, and you can kind of get a head start on a lot of your vegetables and then transplant them outside after all danger of frost. On every package of your seeds, there's a lot of different information. A lot of times people say, you know, how deep and everything or how long, but if you can just read the back of your vegetable package there, it kind of gives you all the details of when to plant and how many rows. When you're planting crops like beans and beets and things like that, you can do succession planting. Like say, for example, you have a 10-foot row of veggies. Rather than plant the whole 10-foot row with beans, maybe plant 5 feet today, wait 2 weeks and plant the other 5 feet. That way there you get a long season of harvest instead of everything coming ripe at the same time. Then you can't handle it all and you're giving it away and everything else, but if you can do some succession planting, that makes a big difference too. On some seeds like peas, you can you can reduce the germination time by pre-soaking them on bigger seeds like peas and corn. You can just put them in a little glass of water and let them soak overnight and then plant them in the morning. Because in order for a seed to germinate, it has to imbibe water. It has to absorb water before it'll start germinating. So if you can do that before you get it in the soil, it's got a head start. And these seeds, this seed company right here, it's Botanical Interest. The owner of this company used to work at Moana Nursery 30 years ago. He started his own business. But he's got a lot of information in the back, and then when you open it up, he's got more information on the inside as far as recipes and everything else. So I think a lot of times, and maybe it just applies to men, we just don't read directions. We just grab the seeds and rip it open and start, you know, planting. And then, you know, later on, you know, the wife's going, well, did you do it this way? No, I just planted them. And so just read the directions and you have a lot of success. We have a lot of perennial vegetables like horseradish and asparagus, and we call these perennial vegetables that need to be planted in their own separate area. You don't want to put it in the main garden per se, but maybe off to the corner because they come back every year. So you may have a little square, and that's where you have your horseradish grown, and your asparagus, which is right here, it requires a large area to plant. So kind of take these guys here and just put in an area where they can just grow free and have full rain, and then you'll have the good success with these guys. Believe it or not, we can grow potatoes here successfully. Now is a good time to get them in. And I tell people, when you cut them up in little sections, let them suberize or dry a little bit, like for a few hours. That way there, the little root cutting doesn't rot. It's kind of suberized and dried, so it does a lot better. Great, well, thank you for coming. And if you have any questions, I'll just stick around for a while and answer them for you.